Good evening, and I'm delighted to welcome you here this evening on this slightly drizzly, damp evening. We're very pleased that you could still make it. I am Karen Taylor. I am Program Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York. The Artisan Lecture Series is supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. We are pleased to present tonight's program in partnership with the Victorian Society, New York. For those of you who may be less familiar with the General Society, a brief introduction. The General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York was founded in 1785 by 22 artisans, who included a blacksmith, a silversmith, a stonecutter, a mason, a saddler, among many other tradesman professions. Our Artisan Lectures is an ongoing tribute to these original craftsmen. Today, our 235-year-old organization continues to serve and improve the quality of life of the people of the City of New York through our educational and cultural programs. These include our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, the General Society Library, which was founded 200 years ago in 1820, our Lock Museum, which is located in the balcony, the John M. Mossman Lock Collection, and you are very welcome to go up and look at the Lock Collection after the lecture tonight, and our lecture series, which was founded in 1837, and of course of which this lecture is part of. You will find more information on the Society on your seat, and if you're interested in library membership, you will find that at the front of the room on the library desk. To introduce our speaker this evening, I am pleased to introduce to you Jeremy Woodruff from the Victorian Society.
I'm Jeremy Woodruff, member of the board of Victorian Society, New York, and I welcome you all to our first lecture of the year. Before introducing this evening's speaker, we have a few announcements of upcoming events. As it's early in the year, the list is long. I'll be brief, but you can find more information on our website, vicsocny.org, that's vicsocny.org, or by speaking to any board member. The Victorian Society has two spring lectures following this one. March 24th on Central Park's original designers' drawings, which will be at the Swedish Church on East 48th Street, and April 21st, cheating scandals on the croquet court, also at the Swedish Church. We're offering 3 exciting spring tours. April 18th will be a day trip to New Haven for, among other things, a curator's tour of the pre-Raphaelite Radical Victorians exhibition at Yale Center for British Art. April 25th, a tour of Victorian Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn. And on May 9th, Edgar Allan Poe's Bronx Haunts. Other VSNY events to look forward to are our March 9th Margot Gale Fund fundraiser concert at Bloomingdale School of Music on West 108th Street, with historical musician and singer Linda Russell bringing to life the tunes of Victorian New York. On May 20th, at Sotheby's Institute on Lexington Avenue at 51st, our emerging scholars will present their research on multiple aspects of Victorian-era culture. Deadline for proposals by students and recent graduates is March 10th. Some related events, not sponsored by VSNY but of similar interest, include a March 10th Met Museum Curators Lecture on Tiffany & Company's 19th century design director Edward C. Moore's taste in ancient glass. This will be at St. Michael's Church on the Upper West Side and is co-sponsored with the Art Glass Forum. On March 10th and March 21st, see, hear, and actually walk through the magnificent 1868 urban organ at Old St. Patrick's Cathedral. These concerts and organ loft tours are sponsored by the Friends of the Urban Organ. See Urban Oregon, E-R-B-E-N, Oregon.org for details. March 17th at 6 p.m., the Rizzoli Bookstore on Broadway is celebrating Vincent DiGirolamo's new book about the history of newsboys and newsgirls. And finally, on April 20th, right here at the General Society Library, co-sponsored by the Royal Oak Foundation, will be Dining in the Gilded Age, Edith Wharton and America's Passion for European Taste. I am now pleased to introduce this evening's speaker, Zachary Violet, who will discuss his first book, The Decorated Tenement, How Immigrant Builders and Architects Transformed the Slum in the Gilded Age. Mr. Violet has a PhD in American and New England Studies from Boston University, is the winner of the 2019 Fred Niffen Award from the International Society of Place, Landscape, and Material Culture, and is the recipient of the 2019 short-term H. Allen Brooks Traveling Fellowship for Travel in Central Europe. He serves on the board of the Vernacular Architecture Forum and is a lecturer at Parsons School of Design, the New School. He is currently researching a follow-up volume to The Decorated Tenement on the inner suburban apartment house in the early 20th century. Following the talk, copies of The Decorated Tenement, which, as you will see, is about much more than the decoration of tenements, will be for sale. Please welcome Zachary Violet.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Jeremy. And thanks to Yukon and Karen Taylor for putting this event together, and the General Society for having me tonight. And thank you all for coming out. And I was really honored by and excited for the invitation to speak to the Victorian Society, because really Victorian architecture is my first love. And this project at least started as an exploration in an incident in 19th century taste. And my remarks tonight will reflect that, even though the book project as it evolved turned into being about a whole lot more. So in July of 1892, The Brick Builder, a newly established publication dedicated to the masonry trades, declared that this image, which had appeared in the previous issue of Scrivener's Monthly, depicted, quote, an ugly, pretentious brick building overloaded with hideous terracotta, which we suppose its architect would call ornament. What a heartless irony, the erection of a pretentious monstrosity such as this for the occupation of poor people, who doubtless have increased rent wrung from them to pay the interest on the cost of the ugly and elaborate detail. Could there be a more striking example of the want of taste, the absence of any sense of fitness, the craving for mere display, the heartless vulgarity which is characteristic of certain elements of the community? The heartless irony to which the editors were referring was a pair of tenements that the author of the original Scribner's article had declared were of the better sort. They had been built 2 years earlier at the corner of Broome and Gorick Street at the far eastern edge of the Lower East Side, just a block from the East River, where they adjoined docks and lumber yards. Designed by German-born William C. Frone, later a prominent designer of tall office buildings, they were built by Bernhard Rosenstock, a Prussian immigrant, and they're shown here in the 1940s tax photo immediately before their demolition. Rosenstock's buildings were of the elaborate type that immigrant builders and architects working in the neighborhood had favored since the 1880s and would continue to build, upper-class opprobrium notwithstanding, for at least a decade more. Each floor of Rosenstock's tenement was marked by exaggerated terracotta bas-relief panels, this was a trademark of Frone, with figural corbels, massive cartouches, and an intricate filigree pattern on the fire escape on each floor, not to mention the overscale urns at the cornice. The building's appearance so shocked the brick builder's sensibilities that it warranted an impassioned screed of nearly 500 words, which encapsulated many of the cultural conflicts that were playing out on the streets of the Gilded Age city. The building was a better sort of tenement in the eyes of Frone, Rosenstock, and his tenants, yet the facade greatly offended the taste of the brick builder and its readers. To them, this level of ornamentation represented an untoward pretense, inappropriate for the working class. The incongruity of elaborate details on a tenement, the editors opined, were not just ridiculous, but becoming more common under the influence of these certain elements of the community. This was no doubt a thinly veiled reference to immigrant builders and architects like Rosenstock and Frone, who were frequently portrayed in this period as both heartless and vulgar. The author found the flamboyant facade delighting in the democratization of these previously elite forms to be simply ugly, displaying a wanton lack of taste on a building considered to be of low status. The issue of cost, addressed here with a feigned air of social concern, was a red herring. Certainly the editors of the Brick Builder knew how cheaply terracotta ornament could be obtained. The matter simply was one of taste and propriety. The author called on his trade to demonstrate an interest in public character to avoid such further outcomes. He then described a proto-modernist approach that was the only type of tenement he could consider appropriate. That was a decently plain, strictly utilitarian building whose effect should depend on a pleasing proportion of mass and relation of voids and solids, and whose details should be of the very simplest, all in plain brick. That was, he contended, the only way a building for the poor and working class could be considered fit for its purpose, no matter what the residents wanted. This view was widely shared, not only by housing reformers, but also in the community of mainstream and elite architects and builders. Yet these were not the people who were affecting the greatest change in neighborhoods like the Lower East Side of New York and the North and West End of Boston. Indeed, in the last 2 decades of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th, these neighborhoods, once notorious for their poor housing conditions, were rapidly being built with new, purposeful, dense tenements whose living standards, while they may have not met middle-class expectations or subsequent ideals, were major improvements upon period working-class housing standards. And this change was carried out almost exclusively by small-scale recent immigrant builders, primarily Italians, Germans, and Eastern European Jews, who built buildings that likewise were designed by immigrant architects who were closely attuned to the taste, desires, and aspirations of their immigrant working-class tenants. In the process, they were helping to wipe away many of the squalid living conditions that had developed in these neighborhoods in the antebellum period. Places like the Lower East Side became overcrowded in this period, with the beginning of mass immigration and the formation of the American working class. The existing housing stock there, which was rapidly converted to handle these new crowds. This led to rapidly deteriorated into horrific condition that many outsiders simply declared were slums. And really the landscapes of economic disparities of this period, which led to depictions like Matthew Hale Smith's frequently reproduced 1868 frontispiece from Sunshine and Shadow in New York, or Jacob Riis's iconic work. These were really salient features of the visual culture of the Gilded Age. Yet, although this fact was scarcely highlighted by period commentators or later historians, many of these squalid landscapes that Riis and other reformers were concerned about were rapidly disappearing beginning in the 1880s and being replaced by blocks of substantial new buildings. And all of this was happening in spite of, indeed quite in opposition to the housing reform movement, which so frequently dominates our narrative on housing in the 19th century city. In fact, our usual reform-centric story privileges the intervention of comfortable, well-established American elites, while at the same time ignores, denies agency from, or even denigrates those immigrants who are trying to improve the conditions of their neighborhoods, largely from the ground up. So in our rush to see only immiseration in the 19th century slums, we have missed the important story of betterment that buildings like these represented. Indeed, their builders have long been derided as skin builders, or treated as the anonymous boogeyman of the real estate speculator. But as I argue in the book, many of these dismissals were deeply intertwined with the xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and anti-urbanism that was fundamental to late 19th century culture. For these builders, building improved tenements was not philanthropy, but a vibrant, indeed highly profitable immigrant enterprise deeply engaged with the culture of these growing enclaves. And although the improvement represented by these buildings was indeed far from skin deep, in my remarks tonight, I will focus on the role that aesthetic questions played in the reception of these improved tenements. Indeed, a major and largely overlooked part of what is significant about these buildings, and why I call the book The Decorated Tenement, was that they looked a lot different than the sort of housing being built and promoted by elite housing reformers. Delighting in their newfound ability, thanks to increasingly affordable industrially produced architectural materials, such as sheet metal, cast stone, and terracotta, these builders appropriated signs of wealth and power and used symbols broadly associated with luxury. So the contrast between the decorated tenement and the reformed tenement can be quite startling. Here, on the right, an average decorated tenement of the last years of the 19th century. On the left, a typical reformer's model of exactly the same moment, designed by prominent architect Ernest Flagg, built by a socialite millionaire as charity. It has a austere facade of glazed white brick. Here, Flagg was clearly following the principles laid out a decade earlier by the writer of the Brick Builder. But the Immigrant building on the right is unconcerned with such opprobrium. It is full of classical terracotta ornamentation in high relief, with a tall sheet metal cornice with gilded letters, and originally gilded letters, proudly announcing its builder's name, Harris Fine. The fact that Fine's building, which when it was new was full of tailors and other workers in the garment trade, was ornamented to a level exceeding not only that of a reform tenement, but even that of a middle-class flat, was a profound achievement. And Fine's tenement, like many like it, had formal dining rooms and parlors, and modern amenities like kitchens with hot water boilers and dumbwaiters, and full private bathrooms. Residents of this building entered through a frescoed and mosaic tiled lobby and ascended a marble treaded stair. These were improvements that even a generation earlier, the urban working class scarcely could have dreamed of. These tenements, therefore, were unmistakable signs of improvement and even communal identity within these iconic ethnic neighborhoods. And the signaling was enacted through architectural ornament, and was innately tied to these rising living standards. Yet these buildings represented an arena of conflict between newly arrived groups and well-established mainstream tastes. And a number of historians influenced by the work of Elizabeth Cohen have noted that many working class, particularly immigrant working class, in this period demonstrated a fondness for elaborate forms, mostly in terms of previous studies, in terms of clothing and furnishings. And these forms were used often in ways that exceeded middle-class standards. And so therefore, the facade of the decorated tenement is important because it is the most durable manifestation of this material culture phenomenon. And the rise of the decorated tenement is, in many ways, a New York story. No American city had a higher visual standard for architecture in this period than New York, which was increasingly becoming the center of national culture. By the mid-19th century, builders of all types routinely took advantage of the city's commercial prosperity, as well as a flourishing industry in the production of architectural materials, particularly cast iron, to produce everyday buildings that would have been perceived of as elegant elsewhere in America. And not only did the middle class demand these forms, the working class increasingly did as well. As early as the 1850s, tenements could be found with elaborate cast iron cornices, sometimes with tall pediments, and molded window caps. And these elements were a reflection not only of the commercial palazzos of the Broadway dry goods merchant, the Broadway dry goods merchant, many of which were designed by the same architects, including John Butler Snook, but also embodied long-standing associations of the Italian Renaissance with urban modernity. And these elements were the go-to for most immigrant and working-class builders in New York between the 1850s and the 1880s, and later in peripheral districts. These were the first decorated tenements, And thousands of such buildings were built, particularly in the building boom that occurred between 1867 and 1872. And on the streets of another city of this moment, even Boston, these decorated tenement palazzos would have passed as a fine commercial block. A mainstream merchant in any small town of the 1860s or 1870s would have been proud to afford such finery, and many made do with far less. These buildings were the first that far exceeded the usual standards of appearance for the working class. But like many products of this era, cast iron, cornices, and window lintels were decorated essentially by default. Thanks to the nature of cast iron production, most ornamental forms could be rendered with moderately little additional expense. Purchasing these items indeed saved the masons substantial labor in constructing complicated parts. Soon, in New York at least, these facades became a symbol of dull monotony, as their sharply limited range of industrially produced ornament quickly lost its ability to invoke a meaningful response. Therefore, elaborate cornices in particular came to be applied to buildings that otherwise evinced little interest in decorative treatment. With ornament becoming cheaper and more common, more elaborate tenements involving a greater number of parts were increasingly necessary if the decorated street facade was to retain its symbolic meaning. Yet, the rise of the most elaborate tenements of the 1880s and 1890s was not simply a story about industrial production making goods more affordable. Instead, the improvement in appearance of these buildings is deeply tied to the rise of mass immigration from Central and Eastern Europe. Particularly, I believe it is the influence of German-trained architects that were responsible for introducing this new, more ornamented mode. And among the most significant were the three Herder brothers, Henry Herder and his brother Peter and Frank, perhaps the most interesting and important designers and builders of working-class housing in this period. The latter two began operating as Herder brothers architects shortly after their arrival in the early 1880s. And the brothers were apparently unconcerned that they would be confused with the other more famous Herder brothers, the elite interior designers and cabinet makers Christian and Gustav Herder, unrelated, who operated under the same name. And perhaps this confusion served the brothers' purpose as well, helping them establish themselves among the immigrant elite. But Peter Herder, at least, had some claim to elite status himself. He was educated at the prestigious Bau Academy in Berlin, one of the most important schools of architecture and construction in Central Europe. And while the nature of Henry and Frank's education is not yet clear, it seems likely that it matched that of their brothers. A polytechnic school for the practical education of prospective state building officials, the Bau Academy of the 1860s and 1870s, in which Herder was educated, emphasized functional expediency in the matters of construction, material, and decoration. The school's pedagogy was heavily influenced by Carl Friedrich Schinkel, one of the most important architects and theorists of the 19th century, who designed the school's iconic brick and terracotta building. But during Herder's attendance at the Institute's primary theorist was Karl Bottcher, author of a landmark study of Greek structure and ornament that was a major part of the school's curriculum. Bottcher emphasized the differentiation of architecture and construction. There was an interest in the Bau Academy in this period in exploring new structural methods and new decorative techniques, particularly the use of iron and terracotta. Bottcher also advocated an intellectual eclecticism that encouraged the intermixing of loosely classical forms. There was also a greatly renewed interest in architectural ornament in this period, in a way that contrasted from the monumental austerity of the earlier works of Schinkel. Students of Bottcher were noted for the richness of their ornament, their free combinations of historical forms, and their interest in classical and figurative elements, all of this restrained by the grid-like framework of articulated piers and spandrels that had been developed by Schinkel earlier in the century. And it's significant, or at least interesting, to note that Adán Lechner was a classmate of Herder at the Bau Academy. One of the most important Hungarian architects of the late 19th century, he was most famous as a founder of the Hungarian secession movement. Oh, there we go. But Lechner's early works consisted mostly of elaborate street facades for Budapest apartment buildings. These buildings, in the architect's own estimation, demonstrated a clear Bauacademy influence. So in a number of ways, the German architectural theory in which Herder was steeped contrasted to important aspects of Anglo-American architectural thought and help us understand the work he would come to do in New York. It is especially noteworthy, this German theory, for its rationalist embrace of new, elaborate architectural materials and a comfort with the apparent dichotomy between facade, structure, and interior. It displayed a lack of concern for truth to materials, and little distrust of industrial production, especially in regards to ornament. Indeed, the mechanical reproduction of historical forms was held to be emblematic of the progress of the age. And these architectural ideas contrasted sharply to the persistent criticism of buildings like the Decorated Tenement, which centered these critiques on their use of industrial machine-worked materials to reproduce historical forms. This critique of this practice was grounded in the work of British theorists like Augustus Welby Northrop Pugin, John Ruskin, and William Morris, all widely read in the United States. And these critics generally held a romantic idea of the place of artists in an increasingly mechanized society. And this, of course, intersected with a long-standing Anglo-American suspicion of display. The commodification of architectural materials, aping historical and sometimes religious forms, was seen by critics like Pugin as a sign of decadence and moral degeneracy. It was in this matter that we see the most significant contrast between the cultural forms and frames of reference of the Anglo-American mainstream and this German and Central European tradition. These competing views of the place of ornament in industrialized society played out on the facade of the Decorated Tenement. But in New York, the Herders were just three of an expanding group of German-born and educated architects who arrived in New York in the mid-19th century. These included William Kurtzer, Frederick Ebling, and Jost Hoffman, among others. All of them came to New York as adults and began working shortly after their arrival, although the precise nature and extent of their training abroad is yet unclear. What is clear is that a generation older than Herder, Henry Fernbach, was also a graduate of the Bauacademy, which he attended before arriving in New York in 1855. A prolific commercial architect and pioneering designer of the cast iron loft, Fernbach is most noted for his 1872 Central Synagogue, which will become an important precedent. But it was the older Herder brother, Henry, who seems to has first taken an interest in the booming market for working-class housing. Employed in the office of the German-born architect August H. Blankenstein, Herder's first American tenements, like this conservative 1885 building for Solomon Jacobs, were virtually indistinguishable from thousands of others dating back to the 1860s. Yet the same year, Henry Herder, working on his own, designed for Jacobs a far richer and more complex facade of a tenement on East Broadway. Jacobs clearly favored this new mode and seems to have embraced Herder's aesthetic experimentation because the very next year, in another tenement for Jacobs, here I'm showing an identical building that's a little bit better preserved, we see Herder has come into a coherent and elaborate facade arrangement. These elements are clearly evocative of Baudicher's influence, indeed common to students of the Bauacademy of this moment, particularly, again, the use of brick piers and terracotta spandrel panels to create a grid on the wall plane onto which these freely interpreted classical motifs were placed, executed in new materials. This pattern was quickly emulated by others in the close-knit community of tenement designers. Indeed, Herder's design for the Jacobs tenement would be widely copied over the next decade. With the success of this new model, Herder would soon leave Blankenstein to join Ernst Schneider, forming Schneider and Herder, one of the most prolific designers of multifamily housing in New York. Schneider and Herder's buildings were built in such great numbers that they represent at least 5% of the extant tenements on the Lower East Side, and their designs were copied very closely by many others. Indeed, they their work represents the late 19th century New York tenement in its most iconic form. But perhaps the most important event in the introduction of this mode in New York was not a tenement commission at all. Early in 1886, the Herder brothers were tasked with the design for the Eldridge Street Synagogue for one of the largest Orthodox Jewish congregations in the city. That the brothers were selected to design this significant project so shortly after their arrival in New York was a clear indication of the esteem to which their European training was held. The architects produced an ornate and loosely Moorish revival-style building that reflected the traditions of the grandest synagogues on the continent, as we'll see in a moment. But later in 1886, for a tenement for Wolf Baum on Broome Street, the architects used moldings and other elements borrowed directly, indeed seemingly cast from the same mold as the Eldridge Street Synagogue. The building used the same buff brick. It has since been painted red. The Baum building employed the same foliate belt courses, window tiffin of bas-relief spandrel panels, and prominent Star of David surrounded by 12 spheres. Baum's tenement is topped by a sheet metal cornice with a broad horseshoe-shaped arch. Set on polished red granite columns. This mirrors the arch on the front of the synagogue and very closely matches in shape, proportion, moldings, and other decorative elements the walnut arc within. And indeed, members of the synagogue building committee became important clients of the Herders and critical promoters of these improved tenements. In the first part of 1887, as the walls of the synagogue were rising, the firm received a crush of commissions for new tenements like Baum's. These included for Senator Jamalowski, a key figure, indeed president of the synagogue, who built a near copy of Baum's Broome Street building on Henry Street. And by 1890, the Herder brothers had designed one or more projects for each of the Eldridge Street Building Committee members. A few words here about style. Ornamented buildings are usually analyzed in terms of architectural style, a topic widely debated in the 19th century age of eclecticism that has engaged architectural historians ever since. Yet this academic categorization of historical forms has been highly problematic in the discussion of the tenement, whose architects, like the Herders, tended to selectively and intentionally embrace and exaggerate certain features while ignoring others. Indeed, many of the most highly developed decorated tenements are quite idiosyncratic in the context of architecture of their moment. Many of these buildings don't fit neatly into well-established monolithic stylistic categories. Instead, their most important aspect was the rising visual standards that were promoted by some builders of working-class housing. The fundamental question that a tenement builder had to ask was not in what style to build, but how much of the newly available ornament to use. Answering this question was far closer to the reality of how speculative buildings were historically designed and experienced, and illuminates much more of the outlook of the builder on his or her building and perceived audience. This newfound ability to create something like visual parity between the tenements and more elite architecture was an important democratizing phenomenon. But this new egalitarianism of degree of ornament was a much more consequential choice than the selection of an academic style, which were essentially fungible. On the other hand, the Herder brothers' use of style is significant and evocative. Take, for example, their loosely Moorish revival 1889 tenement that you see on the far left, built for Isaac Geddes, another prominent member of the Eldridge Street Synagogue Building Committee. Here, dramatically, we see moldings, panels, niches, even colonnettes that were clearly identical to those on the Eldridge Street building. But his choice of style, whether for religious or residential building, was far from neutral. Indeed, the Moorish revival style had complicated and contradictory implications in the 19th century discourse on architectural form. As a number of architectural historians have noted, Moorish revival architecture, particularly in Europe, was thought to be a specifically Jewish style. The style had become standard for ambitious synagogues on the continent since mid-century. Peter Herder, for instance, would have been familiar with the Orenburger Strasse Synagogue in Berlin, a prominent structure whose newly finished dome was visible from the Bauakademie when he was a student there. Yet this style was considered by a number of European architectural critics to be weak and overly decorative, inferior to the Gothic and the Classical Revival with their vaunted connections to Western civilization. Indeed, Karl Bottcher, the German critic who was almost certainly Peter Herder's teacher, declared the style, quote, a phantasmagoric art that destroyed its art form by overlaying buildings with an opulent and meaningless coating. To mainstream taste, it was at least exotic, magical, or frivolous, and used as such. Yet at the same time, architects like Herder's were creating with these buildings, for the first time, a finely textured, richly symbolic landscape that did not just indicate a community's rising wealth and increasing living standards, but encoded meaningful symbols of communal identity, tying together secular and sacred landscapes in important ways. Indeed, this association led one housing reformer to identify the decorated tenement, quote, as simply the crude and flamboyant monstrosities of the Jewish builder. So while the interest in highly evocative styles waned by the 1890s, construction of elaborated buildings would continue apace for a decade and a half. Regardless of stylistic choice, it is important to see the decorated tenement in a transnational context. Indeed, the decorated tenement of Boston and New York was part of a tradition of residential street facades that developed on the European continent in the mid-19th century. There, plaster and stucco forms, often industrially produced, came to ornament the facades of multifamily buildings of all classes. These are most famous in Berlin, as the slide I'm showing here. The German Metropolis was said to be the largest tenement city in the world in this period, and its speculatively built rental barracks were usually long, narrow buildings of two-room flats that were economically zoned front to back and top to bottom, with residents of all classes sharing the same elaborate entrances along with commercial and industrial uses. And the facades of these buildings were rich with these overscaled neo-Baroque details that in certain instances look a lot like those seen on the streets of New York. But this propensity toward facade ornamentation and its seemingly direct connections to the New York tenement is seen throughout Central and Eastern Europe. Among the most important cities of the region to exhibit these facades is Łódź, now in modern Poland, but part of the Russian Empire in the 19th century. It is particularly noteworthy because it contains an extensive landscape of dense and robustly ornamented 4- and 5-story tenements, largely a product of German and Jewish entrepreneurs. It was one of the most remarkable centers in Eastern Europe, a 19th century industrial boomtown that defined its modernity and cosmopolitanism through the use of architectural ornament on buildings of all types. Hundreds of privately built tenements with elaborate facades surrounded the city's textile mills, which were some of the largest on the continent. And Łódź's architecture was vividly described at the height of its building boom by novelist Władysław Remont in his 1899 novel, The Promised Land. Remont's characters were in awe of the large and beautiful houses that looked like museums but served only as warehouses. Houses overburdened with ornament in every possible style, with Renaissance caryatids on the bottom supporting stone balconies, bay windows. The second story in Louis XV floated upwards in sinuous lines of window frames, and the finishing touch was added by bulging ornament reminiscent of spools of cotton. The streetscape, according to Remont, was a veritable rubbish heap of every possible style, overloaded with stone balconies, caryatids, ostentatious facades, roof balustrades. But the tenements had awful courtyards, reminiscent of mine shafts full of shops, offices, warehouses, and dirty little junk shops. But the urban context of Vilna, or Vilnius, in modern Lithuania is perhaps even more important to our story. Indeed, a large number of New York tenement builders originated in this city, perhaps more so than any other single place in the region. And in Vilnius, we find not only stucco facades similar to those we find in Berlin, but more importantly, a distinctive regional facade type that eschewed stucco ornament for complex, highly plastic facades, often of pressed brick, with a grid of piers and piers and spandrels again, which enlivened with what appears to be terracotta or cast stone ornament. Especially when rendered in buff brick, as many of them are, their similarities to the New York examples is particularly noteworthy. And it's important to note that the builder of the Herder design building on the right, which has since lost its multiple horseshoe-shaped arches on the cornice, had immigrated from Vilnius less than a decade before he commissioned Herder to design this building. So the connection between these modes of architectural thought is significant. And these facade styles were particularly common also further south in Kiev, a larger city where street facades of tenements were treated with a flamboyance and bombast not dissimilar to Herder's work. Here, the treatment of brick facades was particularly assertive, and the forms less the familiar Renaissance or Baroque classicism seen in the more Western cities. Indeed, ornament in these buildings, particularly in Kiev, was noted for their interest in non-Western motifs, with a distinct preference for Neo-Byzantine and what's generally called the Russian Revival style, one of the great regional revivals of the period. And even where these compositions contain a greater number of classicizing elements, they were generally more robust and set within an assertively divided facade. And both the stucco and brick examples are roughly contemporary with those seen in New York, and they shared the propensity to overload facades with a mechanically reproduced ornament and exhibited many of the same idiosyncrasies, some would say naivete, in rendering those forms that the New York buildings did. So clearly these buildings formed an important precedent for the New York tenement builder and designer. It is clear at the very least that these immigrant builders and architects were employing familiar modes of gentility, urban decorum, and responsibility towards the streetscape, even if they were out of sync with mainstream American expectations. The Decorated Tenement fundamentally embodied lessons learned in the streets of Central and Eastern Europe and adapted to the American streetscape. Indeed, with a constant flow of people and ideas from cities like Berlin, Kiev, and St. Petersburg, these cities clearly influenced the everyday streetscape of New York as much as any other European city, even more so, I would argue, than Paris. Indeed, while historians have frequently suggested that Americans looked to Paris in the 19th century as the paragon of urban cosmopolitanism, this is a rather elitist view. It was informed, of course, by the presence of the intellectually important École des Beaux-Arts and the influence of a number of American architects who trained there. Yet, Paris's Haussmann apartment buildings, so celebrated by many American designers, was only a small part of this larger continental tradition. And despite the work of architects like Richard Morris Hunt and other Paris-trained practitioners, these architects failed to devise a mode of apartment house design that was as widely adapted to the American streetscape as the decorated tenement. But as the quote that opened my remarks tonight suggested, this flowering of elaborate forms among immigrant tenement builders did not sit well with many in the American mainstream. The most revelatory example of the elite consensus about the most rational approach to the design of low-income housing market was this 1885 block of tenements for the estate of A.B. Schumerhorn, a member of one of the oldest and wealthiest families in the city. 25 feet wide, each building had only tiny light wells. A year later, buildings of this type would be outlawed. Built at the same time as Herder's most important experiments, buildings like this were planned to the minimal standards of the worst speculator-built tenements. But unlike most tenements, this block was designed by one of the city's most elite architects, George B. Post, a favorite of the city's wealthy. Yet Post's facade is among the most austere of any tenement in the city. It is, of course, noteworthy that it was designed at exactly the same time that Post was working on the designs for the house of Cornelius Vanderbilt. But a more important and relevant comparison was this 1885 building also designed by Post, also for a Schumerhorn heir. This loft building had elaborate terracotta trim and shell-shaped cornice, when the moldings and keystones featured aquatic motifs. This iconography signaled the uses of the building, which was occupied by seafood dealers and stood next to the city's fish market. The ornament on the Akumari loft as a business building signaled respectability of its commercial tenements with durable, stylish terracotta forms. But no such message was required on the East 3rd Street tenement. Its working-class tenants could only properly be housed in an austere, utilitarian building fit for its purpose of providing minimal shelter and making money, but little else. But the scorn for the tenement suggested by these examples was particularly prominent among housing reformers, many of whom were convinced of the moral inferiority of multifamily living. The case for improved urban working-class housing seemed to them not just hopeless, but undesirable. A growing consensus was hostile to the very existence of the tenement, no matter how reformed, and this consensus considered its eventual elimination in favor of a cottage in the countryside or the suburbs to be the highest social good. In fact, the increasing popularity of multifamily living, whether occupied by rich or poor, was to some a threat to cherished myths of American exceptionalism. But anti-tenement reformers took on a particularly American sort of fanaticism in this regard. They couched their arguments often in religious terms, seeing tenements as treacherous deviations from a divinely inspired social order. William B. Peterson, a leader in the Methodist Episcopal Church, was perhaps the most unabashed, suggesting with rhetorical flourish that the biblical murderer Cain himself was the originator of the tenement. Patterson plainly articulated an idea commonly held by many American Protestants, quote, "The tenement is an impediment to God's plan for the home. No matter how decent, safe, or commodious such a building could be made, he insisted, this basic fact will remain." Jacob Riis basically agreed with this formulation, and perhaps his most fanatical statement, he proclaimed in 1889 that a shanty is better than a flat in a cheap tenement any day. To Riis, the individuality of this upper Manhattan shantytown was more important than the conveniences and stylishness of the tenements rising behind it. Therefore, the decorated tenement was antithetical to the sort of change most elite reformers were trying to bring about, a reform not just of housing standards, but of morality, culture, and taste. Indeed, Riis reported with horror as, quote, "The owners of a block of model tenements uptown had got their tenants comfortably settled and were indulging in the high hopes of redemption under proper management," no, it's the tenants under management, when a contractor ran up a row of skin tenements, shaky but fair to look at, with brownstone trimming and gewgaws. The result was to tempt a lot of well-housed tenants away. And to Riis, builders like that were simply doing, quote, "the devil's work." The design of their model tenements, therefore, was rooted in the belief that they were at best provisional until more ideal types of housing could be provided in the suburbs. Backers thus had to manage their residents' preferences accordingly. As Elgin Gould, president of the City and Suburban Homes Company, noted of model tenements in 1896, quote, "It's never advisable to make this class of building too attractive, lest workers who could afford to move to the suburbs be tempted to stay in the center city." Or, as prominent reform architect Grosvenor Atterbury noted in 1906, quote, "Flourishes are not wanted any more than they can be afforded." The model tenement to someone like Atterbury was supposed to serve a didactic role, and the lesson was political. He hoped to use his designs to impose a traditional monolithic view of national culture. In the design for his model tenement, to be occupied largely by immigrant tenants, he sought, quote, "the cultivation of a national sentiment, one of the American ideal is exemplified in our great patriots. Through the use of appropriate architectural forms," he asserted, "the social and political dangers of the tenement district could be ameliorated. A well-designed project," he argued, could, quote, "combat the corner saloon and the district boss, the translators of freedom of conscience of our forefathers into the free graft of today." Yet it is clear that many immigrant tenants preferred the stylish respectability of the new, elaborate tenements to the puritanical, decorous, visual austerity of the reformers' model. Indeed, Gould bitterly complained about tenants' quote, "prejudice against the appearance of his organization's buildings." And for good reason. The model tenements encoded in built form much of the spirit of the housing reform movement. Its good intentions and high-handed moralism, its public spirit, but seeming greater concern for spiritual than material well-being, its insistence on purity and simplicity, and its mistrust or understanding of urban working-class culture. So in the context of all this agitation, in May of 1900, an intriguing feud played out on the usually anodyne pages of the Real Estate Record and Builder's Guide, the primary organ of New York's building trades. In it, Peter Herder presented an article in which he encapsulated insights from 2 decades as one of the most important and prolific designers and builders of modern tenements. He was the sort of person that Jacob Riis thought was doing the devil's work, and his highly evocative ornament nothing but gewgaws. But Herder's 1900 article was one of the few pieces of writing in this period that unproblematically cast the decorated tenement as a rational commercial product, calibrated to meet the needs, desires, and aspirations of its resident and to profit the builder. Indeed, for at least a decade and a half, as both designer and builder, Herder had been proving that, quote, the desire of the East Siders for better things is clearly shown by the success that has attended the erection of better tenement houses. In doing so, he struck a nerve among the increasingly strident proponents of housing reform, whom Herder had derided as sentimental and ignorant. Ernest Flagg, the well-known Paris-trained architect who was among the leaders of that movement, took particular exception, responding to Herder's article with another impassioned screed. In Flagg's view, Herder's designs, his tenants, and the architect himself were in dire need of reform. Yet Herder, on the other hand, insisted the wealthy architect knew little about tenement residents' needs and desires. The architect sharply criticized Flagg's vaunted open court plan, devoid of many of the improvements of appearance and accommodation that Herder had been promoting since the 1880s. Instead, Flagg's facade were austere blank walls. Herder could barely contain his contempt. Quote, I almost fear poor Mr. Flagg made a mistake, he said of such model tenements, and instead of sending you a plan for a tenement house, he sent you a plan that was left over in his office for a poorhouse or a prison. I should think with a few modifications in the interest of decency, health, decency, and cheerfulness of the inmates, his plan for a model tenement might do well for the criminal or indigent. Recognizing that buildings like Flagg's replace cherished status symbols of the working class with, at best, nominal improvements in sanitation and privacy, Herder declared Flagg's model tenements as buildings which, like medicine, may be good, but are nasty to take. The disdain Flagg and many other elite reformers had for the wants, desires, and tastes of most immigrant tenants led Herder to conclude, quote, the greatest enemies of the poor have often been their public friends. Thank you so much.
We'll be doing Q&A. Please wait for the microphone to be passed to you and speak directly into it for the recording. Thank you.
I wondered if you would speak to fire escapes.
Yes, defining feature, of course. First required in the very first tenement code in the 1860s requires at least one per floor. By the 1880s, you have to have one per unit, and become increasingly strict in the 1920s and 30s. So you can see in buildings like this one, sort of a very light, dainty fire escape. These are the original intention for these buildings. And you'll see most have sort of the 2 central bays recessed to accommodate fire escapes there. The ones that we see today, if it's occupied now, it was rebuilt in the 1930s, bigger, more robust, sort of more definitional in that way.
I'm curious about the interior design of these tenements. Was it pretty much uniform? Was there much variation? And I have this notion of the old law tenement, and when did that change, and is that what we're looking at here?
So interior versus plan and interior versus decoration, right? Plan, there are sort of standardized models that people like Herter are working on improving, right? This is, of course, the question is how do you stuff all of these people on a 25-foot lot? And that is sort of the greatest amount of experimentation. In the standard talk, I talk a lot about sort of the way these floor plans evolved. And so there is definitely an evolution, definitely a desire to sort of improve both accommodation and, both space and features, right? And sort of much more improvement on, do you get sinks, do you get boilers, do you get dumbwaiters? Those things were easier to accommodate than do you get a bigger living room or better light and air? These architects were playing more with features than space, to the constrained sort of by the 25-foot lot. The tenants themselves were using much of the same sort of aesthetic theory that you see on the facades, right? And that's sort of part of the argument, that there is sort of a fairly well-documented trend towards fairly elaborate interiors to the extent the tenants could afford. They had wallpaper, fabric hangings, things like this, that sort of exist as a continuum between sort of the facade, the preferences of the builders and the preferences of their tenants. And that's sort of part of the argument that I'm making here on that. What was the second bit of the question?
The old law.
Okay, so there are increasing, part of what I'm doing in the book is trying to sort of move away from that sort of reform-centric formulation, right? There are important changes in the tenement code that happen in 1879, 1886, and 1901. 1901 is the line between old law and new law. So actually most everything that I've shown you today is old law. But I argue it changes the shape to a certain extent, but not the substance of tenement building, particularly the earlier ones. 1900, there are other factors that it's part of the reason this culture goes away, but not all of it, right? The 1901 law, contrary to somewhat popular perception, did not put an end to tenement building on the Lower East Side, did not stop these builders. It made it a little bit more complicated. It made it a little more capital intensive, so the smaller builders tend to get pushed off after 1901. But fundamentally, you see these same buildings being built sort of for a much longer period.
What is like the maintenance cost for running HVAC system and the other building mechanical system for these buildings right now?
That is a question sort of above my pay grade in terms of cost. Certainly people do it, and there is sort of a great sort of evolution of sort of the mechanical systems within these buildings, both as new, right? Part of the way improvement gets defined in this period is increasingly you get buildings that are built with first coal grates, then steam heat. Steam heat tends to be retrofitted into a lot of these buildings in the early 20th century. In terms of and then I think now we sort of see a number of changes to that in sort of more recent decades, but that's another story.
First of all, I absolutely loved what you were doing when I discovered your dissertation. I was preparing for Jane's Walk in the East 70s of the reform tenements there, but also showing the things that led to them. And I was absolutely amazed of your courage in seeing the socially valuable side of a taboo subject. And with that in mind, what is the current status and what are the future prospects for tenement preservation and particularly historic district preservation of tenements?
I have talked to a lot of people who are very much interested in that question. I think it is astonishing the extent to which these landscapes still exist. That there are blocks and blocks and blocks and blocks of these buildings that are incredibly well preserved. And in some ways, astonishingly, because there has been a century of slum clearance trying to get rid of these. Ernest Flagg said these buildings are not long for the world, but yet we still have there's over 3,000 of them in the Lower East Side alone. But part of the problem, and I don't want to be immodest in this, but part of the problem is not having a real historical context to understanding these buildings. The discourse in housing in this period almost uniformly has been about reform. and not about what most of the buildings there are like. So if you're trying to justify a landmark nomination for a building that the significance isn't clear unless it's a reform building, right? Because that's the context that we have. So part of the project is to sort of build a different, more egalitarian, more open-minded historical context for what these buildings really meant when they were new.
Back to fire escapes. I didn't notice any of them on the European buildings. Is that strictly a New York City innovation, a requirement?
It's largely a New York City innovation, and getting into sort of the planning differences between the European buildings and the New York ones, it's complicated. They tend to be shallow and built in ranks, so they have sort of interior and exterior circulation. So you're seeing a lot of circulation that's going around the back of it. They're also solid masonry buildings that don't tend to be as fragile and as fire prone as the ones in New York, so that there's less of a push towards it. So yeah, you don't have those imposed metal fire escapes the same way you do in New York. And it is sort of an important visual contrast between those buildings, yes.
Last question.
I was wondering, the actual people that lived there in the buildings was pretty horrible existence. So no matter what the facades of all of these buildings were, and choose your favorite architecture and clothe the facades with that, what's the record on the people living there and existed in these conditions? One other thing, Chicago, why is it so different, Chicago, as far as the skyscrapers, the housing, and so forth, compared to New York? But the first question is what I would be really interested in.
Certainly these buildings did nothing to ameliorate the grinding poverty in these neighborhoods, right? It's important that we understand that. However, there is a rising increase in housing standards. It's horrible by contemporary standards. It was bad by middle-class standards. These were good for working-class standards in this period. And that's the lens I think we need to look at them at, right? These are better than what they replaced. These are better than the iconic slums. They're not perfect, right? It's improvement. And there are improvements that I didn't talk about tonight in what sort of the actual living standards within the buildings are, sort of what kind of space, how much space, how it's arranged, and what sort of features you have. So, but part of the trick to it is that what you're seeing going on the facade is reflecting the improvements that are happening inside. Again, not great to 20th century standards, but improving 19th century standards. These were better than what was getting built and what most of the people who were moving into them could have expected before this sort of wave of tenement improvement, right? And I think that's an important argument to make, right? Not perfect, but better. And we've sort of lost better in a rush to, even the reform buildings did not improve the standards the way we hoped, and in some cases made sort of living a tenement life worse. And it's an argument I didn't get into today, but it's sort of a lot of the ways in which these buildings worked were actually poorer than many of these speculator-built buildings. In terms of Chicago, it's an interesting question. It's an interesting question on how land gets utilized. Where you get multifamily housing there, you're not building party walls, right? You're building sort of freestanding buildings that have light on four sides, even if they're densely packed. They're three-story things. In part, you're not on an island. It's a prairie. You're a little bit more spread out. There are geographic factors, and I think there are cultural factors to why sort of Chicago gets its landscape versus the way New York does. And that's answering how any of this happens is complicated. Thank you.
Zachary, before you step away, I own behalf of the General Society, and I'm sure the Victorian Society, want to thank you so much for such a comprehensive look at the tenements and for your illumination on the social history that dictated the way these tenements were built. We're very grateful to you for sharing your expertise.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And we would like to make a presentation to you this evening to commemorate your talk at the General Society. And to do this is our Executive Director, Victoria Dangle.
And thank you, Zachary. That was wonderful. And you know what was amazing watching the slides and thinking about the Lower East Side or many neighborhoods is, again, homage to the building trades, that these structures are still standing, and they were well-built structures. So, and here's to many of them being preserved. And thank you for bringing all of this to light. So on behalf of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York, founded 1785, we express our gratitude to Zachary J. Violette, architectural historian and author, for The Decorated Tenement, How Immigrant Builders and Architects Transformed the Slum in the Gilded Age, for his participation in the General Society Artisan Lecture Series. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Amazing. Thank you.
And because, Zachary, there's another book inside of you, we've made you, no pressure though, a lifetime member of the library. Okay?
Thank you so much. Thank you.